בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב. Our show today takes us to a very different background than what we spoke about in the last few weeks. And I would admit that I needed a break from, from Jewish existence in Europe of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. It's a tragedy, and learning it again and again from different angles doesn't necessarily makes you, cheerier. So I thought it would be nice to take some break and to go as almost as far as you can to a country that didn't was not involved in the world wars, at least not in a meaningful way, and that is Yemen. And also because we didn't speak about the Jewish community in Yemen almost at all in all of our here and there. We spoke about, if you remember, we spoke about Rav Shalom Sharabi 2 years ago, I think. But really, we didn't speak about the Yemenite Jewish community enough. And so I thought it would be important to learn about Rav Yih Qafih, who was a very interesting and important personality in his own right. Also, his legacy was continued by Rav Yosef Qafih, that was very much known here in Eretz Israel. If some of you have children or grandchildren in the Mamlachti Dati system, then a few years ago he was chosen, he and his wife, not our hero, his grandson, and so Rav Yosef Qafih and his wife, the Rabbanit Bracha Qafih, they were chosen as Dmuyot Mofet, figures to emulate, I guess, in role models. Yeah, thank you. In the Mamlachti Dati schools. So that's this is a person that was important in his own time and also has a legacy that was carried to our own times, as I hope to be able to describe as we would reach the conclusion of our shiur. But also his activity, achievements, and also difficulties and challenges does reflect the situation in the Jewish community of Yemen of the time. So I think it's also an interesting exploration into this larger background of Yemen and the Jewish community in it. So first, a short reminder of maybe for many of us just to learn about the history of Yemen in the 19th century. I'm not going now to speak about the history of Yemen. I'm also very far from being the right person to speak about it. So Yemen in the 19th century, that was a very difficult time for the Yemenites in general. I'm not speaking just necessarily on the Jews now, but it was a difficult time after a few hundred years of relatively good times and prosperity under the Imams from the dynasty of Qasim, not necessarily always good for the Jews, but I'm speaking now in very general terms. However, in 1808 began a revolt by some of the tribes that felt that they are not being, basically they are not being bribed enough to accept the ruling of the Qasim Imam. And as the revolt was spreading in 1818, there was another התפרצות, uprising, yeah, upheaval, and the capital, Sana'a, that also had the greatest Jewish community, was almost completely destroyed. And the Wahhabs, which to this day, unfortunately, are active, they also were threatening to open war. And then the Egyptians were fighting against the Wahhabs, so they entered into Yemen in order to fight the Wahhabis, but on their way also obviously they left destruction in their wake. Then the Ottomans entered, and in 1872, Yemen was reconquered by the Ottomans. Again, they controlled Yemen 300 years before, but they were disposed. And now in 1872, they reconquer Yemen and make it into part of their Ottoman Empire. Now, that came with some benefits and also with some drawbacks and difficulties. The obvious benefits were that you are now part of a big empire and you can just travel and commodities can be brought in, which is, again, for us living in our global world, seems as a simple thing. But for the Yemenites, after a very difficult time of separation, and that's a country that was never too much rich in the natural resources. So being able to import was very, very important and contributed to some restabilizing of the economic system. Also, the Ottomans were, at least officially, they gave freedom of religion and some type of civil rights to the, now I'm going more specifically into the Jews. On the other hand, it's different, but if you enter into the head of the Jews in Yemen, then the entrance of the Turks for them is like the entrance of the French to the Jews of Eastern Europe. Now, Napoleon and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire do not have the same ideas of how to control states or what civil rights should be given. But in some proportion, it's the same culture shock, because the Turks did have certain cultural achievement. They did had some connections with European culture, and all of that is now entering in a measure into Yemen, and that would cause the beginning of the decline of traditional Judaism. So that in 1872. So that is the background of our story. And now I would speak about our hero, Rav Yiḥyah Qafih. It is being transcribed in different ways. Qafih, Qafiḥ, Al-Qafih. I don't think that it's really important for our purposes right now. Here in Israel, we are used to the pronunciation Qafih, and if it is, I hope that it is in a way it is accepted. So Qafih, Rav Yiḥyah Qafih, or the way that the Yemenites Jews would call the rabbis, not necessarily Rav, but Muri. So Muri or Mari, or Muri Yiḥyah Qafih, or Qafih. So Yiḥyah Qafih was born in 1850 in Tzana, to this Jewish community, and he was able to quote 11 generations before him. So he had a very good sense of his familial history. Now, I used a few sources for the purpose of this shiur. To the rest of my knowledge, there is no still a formal or a scientific biography of Rav Yiḥyah Qafih. I used a pamphlet, you may say, or short book named Igeret Abuchim, a letter of tears, that was written immediately after his death, in which there is a description by one of his Talmidim of his life. As you can understand, that's not scientific. It gives you a lot of information, but written by one of the students, you can expect a certain one-sidedness. Also, because his grandson, who was taught by him and became a very important rabbinical personality here in Israel. So in some of the memory books about Rav Yosef Qafih, they would also write about his grandfather because of the great influence that his grandfather had on him. So I also used a sefer that was written on Rav Yosef Qafih by his own granddaughter. So that is the granddaughter of Rav Yosef Qafih, who is the grandson of our hero. So I also, but it carry with it some very interesting family stories that were not shared in the biography that I mentioned, and also a few articles that I read for the purpose of the shiur. Now, unfortunately, there were some or many even differences, especially regarding the first stages of his life. So as always, I am not an historian. I didn't check the prime sources. I don't read Arabic. I don't read Jewish Yemenite language. I don't know what name they're using to it even. And I didn't interview people that knew the people that knew. So I'm only giving you what to me seems as making sense. And if you want, I just give you the sources and you can follow them up yourself and come to other conclusions. So according to one source, he was able to trace, as I said, 11 generations before his birth, and all of them were Rabbanim. According to all the other sources and also according to the story, I don't think that is true. It may be that some of them were Talmidei Chachamim, and I guess that in 11 generations, every family would have one Rav. So maybe some of them were Rabbanim, but it doesn't seem to me that it was necessarily a rabbinical family in the strong sense of this term. But they were, as all the other Yemenite Jews at the time, they were very traditional, very observant, and just Jews that wanted to fulfill the will of the Creator. So he was born, as I said, in 1850. His mother passed away when he was 1 year old. And here again, there is they are very different in accounts. According to some of the accounts, his father passed away when he was 6 years old, or 5 years old. According to the other account, his father remarried and moved with his wife to another city, living, according to both accounts, from now on he would be raised by his own grandfather, which was called Salem or Reb Salem. So I have no way to tell you what is true. I would say that according to the Igeret HaBochim, right, according to the letter that was written by his student, then his father died when he was 5 years old. According to the story, if I understand the story correct, according to the story told by the granddaughter of his grandson, then the father moved away. Now, it may be that both are true, that the father moved away and then died after a year. It doesn't necessarily have to be a contradiction, but we are just standing sometimes in front of different pieces of the puzzle, and you don't even know if they are supposed to replace each other, to somehow connect with each other. It's a personal tragedy, that is for sure. So he's being raised as an orphan. Now we have to understand that in Yemen, it's a very, very challenging situation to be in, because in Yemen, there was what was called the Orphans Decree, Zeirat HaYetomim. And that was that if you are an orphan, then you must be Islamized. Because if you are a child with parents, then it makes sense that you'd be raised by your parents. But if you don't have parents, you'd be taken care by the state. That's a very social law. Now, you'd be taken care by the state. What institution do the states have? Obviously, Muslim orphan houses. And you would be sent to there. And that is by a law, meaning you cannot refuse the law. Usually, as you can imagine, the Jewish community would hide these orphans and they would do their best, smuggle them out of Yemen sometimes. They would do their best in order to avoid this outcome. And many would be married in very young age because of that situation. Here, it seems that the grandfather was somehow able to register him, maybe as his own son or part of the household, so somehow they were able to avoid this orphan decree. However, the grandfather was extremely poor and was not able to pay for a melamed. So he was not able to put him into a school, as we would call it today. Now, the schools there were something that we would be more familiar with from the Cheder system. It was not a modern school. It was a room in which there was a muri, meaning a teacher, and there would be a variety of children sitting, and according to the level of the teacher would be the level of the teaching. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. One of the most acclaimed teachers in Yemen was a man named Rav Chaim Korach. Now, one thing seems to stand out, And that is that now I don't have a real expertise. I'm just giving you my reflection, what seems to me, and that is that in Eastern Europe, many times the people that would end up as melamdim were not necessarily the most successful in society. However, in Yemen, it seems that it was a very respectful, it was a very respectful occupation to be a melamed tinokot, mikrei dardeke, to be a teacher to the children. So there, many times, the rabbis would be these children teachers. It seems that at least partly the reason was, and that's here we enter into one of the most important subjects of the shiur today, that the Yemenites tended to follow the Rambam's ruling. In many areas, they accepted the Rambam upon themselves already 800 years before, 700 years before, as the Rambam wrote them a letter, Igeret Teiman, it's called, in which he helped them and it strengthened them while they were dealing with very hard times, and they accepted his book Hayad HaChazaka as their codex, and they would even in their Kaddish, we have testimonies for that in their Kaddish they would say Bechayechon uVyomichon uVechayei dechol Beit Israel uVechayei de Marana Rabbi Moshe. So they added the Rambam into their Kaddish. That was the extent of their acceptance of him. And so they also follow this ruling that a rabbi is not allowed to make a living out of his Torah teaching. So how can he make a living? Many of them would work. So they would work half a day and they would rabbinize half a day. Otherwise, they could be children teachers. It was accepted that if you're a teacher of a children, you are being paid for being a teacher. That was fine. That's accepted by the Gemara. So of course the Rambam would agree to that. The Rambam was against people that would say, give me money in order to learn. But if you are teaching children, that's obviously something that is needed and you should be paid for that. So that's so in Europe, you could be paid just by being a rabbi. So not necessarily you would become a children teacher. But in Yemen, because that was almost the only, there were others, but it was one of the main occupations that a sage can take, then that channeled into the schools the best quality of teachers. So that's a very interesting outcome of this ruling of the Rambam. So it seems that the quality of the teachers in Yemen was of a higher degree than in Eastern Europe. Now, of course, that's a generalization. That's clear. But it does seem to be understood from what I read. So, Reb Chaim Korach, he was considered the best teacher in Tzana. And so the young child, 6 years old, 7 years old, Yiḥyah Kapach, wanted to learn, but his father couldn't afford to pay the teacher. So the child would stand behind the door and listen to the classes inside. And according to the story that he himself told to his own grandson many years later, one day he was standing there, after a few days that he was standing there just listening behind the door, the Rav needed to go out for some reason, and when he opened the door, suddenly the child falls in. And Yiḥyah was so, the young Yiḥyah was so scared, 6 years old, and he was so scared that he ran home. And Rav Chaim Korach went in the evening. He let him run home. But in the evening, he went to his grandfather and said to him, you can bring your grandson for free. I would teach him for free. I would not charge you for teaching him. And so Yiḥyah, young Yiḥyah, began to learn by Mori Chaim Korach. Now, as I said, Rambam was very strong in all of Yemen, but especially so in the cheder, in this classroom of Chaim Korach. Why? It's very interesting. Chaim Korach believed, and that's he even wrote that if you are learning Rambam strong enough, you would be spared of Gilgul. Gilgul means reincarnation. right? Coming back into this world again. Now, this, what I just described, is a very interesting phenomena that is very, in a sense, it's very special to Yemen of the time. And that is a combination and intertwining of a very strong Rambam mystic position together with a very, very massive and strong Kabbalah infiltration or into the Yemenite Jewry. Now, it seems like a type of a sharpness, saying if you'd learn Rambam well enough, you'd be spared of Gilgul, while Rambam obviously did not believe in the concept of Gilgul. So the whole thing is very strange to us, but not for them. Now, again, without going into very deeply into the history of Yemenite Jewry, we have to know that although they accepted Rambam upon themselves, as I said, in the 12th century, but some things happened between the 12th century and the 19th century that we are now speaking about. And part of it was that a very large part of the Syrian community, Jewish community, for different reasons, found itself in Yemen. They were called the Shamim, right? Because Sham is a word for Syria. So the Shamim are Jews that came from Syria to Yemen, and we speak hundreds of years ago. So now you cannot differentiate between them from external appearance. However, they carried with them the costumes, the minhagim from Syria. So they brought with them the Shulchan Aruch, they brought with them the Sephardic Siddur, they brought with them strong applications of Kabbalah, and they intermixed with the Baladi. Baladi means original. So they intermixed with the Jews, Yemenite Jews that were there before. Now, many Jews in Yemen accepted the influx of the Syrian Jews, the Shamim, and accepted many of their minhagim. Other Yemenite Jews, as you know, has happened many. Just think about Ashkenazim and the Sephardic Siddur vs. The Ashkenaz minhag. So it's more or less the same idea. So you'd have the Sfard, which would be Shamim, and you'd have the original to the Jews that live there, which is the Baladi for the Yemenites. Now, the Baladis also, although they tried to keep their original positions that mainly flowed from the Rambam, still there are always, when two communities live not only one next to the other, but they were intermarrying, so no problem with that. So there was a diffusion of Smoza and Minhagim were interchanging. And so also by the Baladim, there were certain Kabbalah Minhagim that came in, and also many ideas of Kabbalah and the learning of the Zohar. All of these were spread in all of the Jews of Yemen. So Reb Chaim Karach here is essentially just a representative of this interesting combination of Rambamistic Jews who are also great believers in mysticism, in Kabbalah, and all that it includes. As we will see, young Yiḥyah Kapach, while right now studying by Rav Chaim Korach and being taught all of this combination, would not continue this tradition. But that is something that we'll see in Be'ez Hashem in a few minutes. In 1860, when he is 10 years old, there is a batzoret, a lack of rain, drought in Yemen, and his grandfather and himself has to move out from Tzana. There is not enough food in Tzana, and they move out to some rural area in which I guess there was more food, and they lived there for a few years, in which the young Yiḥyah had to learn by himself. There are many testimonies about how we would sit in the Bet Midrash in this small village, right? Nothing there, and he himself is sitting with a sefer and just sitting and learning. By the way, when you're speaking about sefer, there is no print in Yemen. The Muslims did not allow printing because that was considered something that can cause political upheaval. So in all of the Ottoman Empire, there were not too much prints, and in Yemen there was nothing. That is, by the way, one of the reasons why the Shamaim, these Jews that came from Syria, were able relatively easily to conquer so many communities. Because if you wanted the Baladi Siddur, you needed to sit down and write the whole Siddur in your handwriting. But the Shamaim came with printed Siddurim. So you can understand, it's much, much, much cheaper. Yeah, yeah, because of the lack of books. When there is a lack of book, then you learn more by heart. They also had this ability. There are stories. He also is telling these stories how they would sit because there would be only one book. So 4 or 5 students would sit. They were not using tables. They were sitting on the floor. There was this very low table they would use, and it would be in the middle, and everyone was able to read from any angle you would position him. And so they were able all to read from one sefer. The poverty there was unbelievable. Unbelievable.
That's why ideas didn't spread so far like in European Jewry.
Because lack of printing. That's right. That's exactly what the Ottomans, they wanted. If everything can be frozen in time, that would be excellent, because we have to understand the Ottomans at that time were already, it was known, they were called the sick men of the Bosphorus. It was clear that they are going to fall apart in the near or the distant future. So for them, the best that can be done is to somehow freeze everything. That's how they saw it. So just freeze, no advance, no progress, no nothing, because obviously if something would advance, we would fall apart. So that's part of the same mindset of trying just to hang on to what there is. In 1864, they are able to return to Tzana, and he begins, he's 14, and so he begins to learn goldsmithing. His family, as I said, I don't think they were rabbis for 11 generations, but it does seem that they were goldsmiths for 11 generations. And that's what the grandfather is teaching his grandson, and he would work in it almost all of his life, again, because even when he'd be a great teacher himself and a great rabbi, he wanted not to take money for Torah teaching. So he would make his livelihood out of being a goldsmith. And by the way, Rav Yosef Kapach, his famous grandson, also was at certain times of his life a goldsmith, and that is an occupation that he learned from his great-grandfather. I mean, his great-grandfather. It's an interesting story. Tells that Rav Salem, right, his grandfather, had a great measure of bitachon in Hashem. And so he would work only very selected hours of the day. The rest of the day he would learn Torah. And that's also what he demanded of his grandson. Now, the grandson one day had an opportunity to strike a deal with a certain Arab trader. So the grandson decided that he would go half an hour before his grandfather to the shop and create these bracelets, right, that the Arab trader was going to buy. However, after he worked for the whole week, reducing from his Torah in order to create these bracelets, the Arab trader did not come on Thursday when he was supposed to come and collect and pay the price. And the grandfather told him, you see, adding in work does not add in money. He broke the bracelets that his grandson created, and he said, from now on, you should have your bitachon b'Hashem, just learn Torah and only work according to your needs. Do not try to earn more than what you need. That's a very different mindset than the consumer society that we live in today. So that's just a thought to hold in our head of the way that they were educated. Now, there are amazing descriptions of his life. He would just a simple example here. That's from a testimony. So he would walk. So when would he walk? From the third to the 6th hour of the night. So for us, let's say the night begins at sunset. So let's say that sunset is at 6 o'clock or 6 o'clock now, more or less. So he would walk from 9 to around 12 at night. And then he would sleep for 2 or 3 hours. Then he would wake up, go to learn by Rav Chaim Korach. So the teacher would also participate in this uh, waking up very early. So if he went to sleep by 12 and then woke up 3 hours later, I guess the shiur would begin around 4 a.m. And then they would learn up to Alot HaShachar, to sunrise. Then they would daven Shachrit. Then breakfast. Continuing learning till the fourth time, meaning the 4th hour. So the fourth, let's say again, let's say that sunrise was at 6 o'clock. So they would continue to learn till 10 o'clock. Then he would go back to work until the ninth hour. So that is 6 and 9. That is until 3 p.m. Then again learning until 9 p.m. when he would return to work again the second shift of the day. Every day for decades. That's how you acquire knowledge, by repeating and repeating and repeating and sleeping 2 or 3 hours a day. That's again, it's very difficult for us, I think, to grasp that even. But that's and he was not the only one there. It was part. They really believed that a person should work and should also study very hard. You can only do that if you really dedicate a lot of hours. So they were willing to sacrifice their sleep for that sake. It was obvious after a short time that he is going to become a great Torah scholar, and his rabbi had began to consult with him when giving halachic responses, in order to consult with him, just in order to maybe the answer would be bettered by that, but also in order to train him in giving halachic responses. In 1870, in the old age of 20, for them, he is married with Naama. And again, it's very tragic. They would have 9 children throughout their life, but very few of them would survive after him. And he lost many children in his own lifetime, which is, of course, devastating. At the same year that he is getting married, also a very important event in his life comes along, and that is that a certain shaliach comes, messenger, delegate, basically it was a researcher from Kiach, Kol Israel Chaverim, that's Alliance in France. And he comes to Yemen. Now he comes to Yemen, his name is Yosef Alevi, and he comes to Yemen in order to have some archaeological research of artifacts from the Sva Empire. And it's a very, very, very specific study that he is doing. However, he is using the opportunity that he visits in Yemen in order also to visit the Yemenite communities. But in order to have a permit from the Yemenite government to come in, he lies to them and he says that he is a shaliach from Eretz Israel, which was, I guess, some type of a condition for them to allow him visiting. So he's also lying to the Jewish community, telling them that he is a shaliach from Eretz Israel, which, as a side effect, also raised his status, because if he's for the Yemenite Jews, as for Jews almost in all of the world, if you're a shaliach from Eretz Israel, you're a rabbi from Eretz Israel, and that's how he introduced himself, then obviously you are a very important Talmid Chacham and a holy person. So he's coming there, and the young Yiḥyah Kapach, together with 2 of his friends, want to impress the rabbi from Eretz Israel. In order to impress him, they wake him up early in the morning, and they take him to the shuls in Tzana, where dozens of Jews sit in every shul and learn the Zohar, because that was the minhag there. You would wake up early in the morning and you would recite the Zohar, not necessarily even understanding what you say, but reciting the Zohar, reciting the Zohar, reciting the Zohar. And they were sure that the Shaliach would be so impressed with the holiness and the scholastic or scholarliness of the Yemenite Jews. However, that was not a rabbi from Eretz Israel. That was a type of a maskil, right? An enlightened, he was religious to an extent, but an enlightened Jew from Paris. He is not going to be impressed by Jews sitting and reciting the Zohar. And he was standing there. Now, on the other hand, he really, and it's clear from the evidence, he didn't want to intervene with the Jews. I think that he didn't want to be exposed, so he preferred to keep quiet. But when his young hosts were pressuring him to show his impression, then he couldn't, I guess he couldn't stop himself anymore. And he said, that's not impressing at all. That they are just wasting their time. The whole Kabbalah thing is a sham. And he began to make some very strong comments against Kabbalah and against the Zohar in particular. And these three young men, one of them is Yiḥyah Qafih, were aghast. How can it be that the important rabbi from Eretz Israel is saying such, is criticizing so sharply the Kabbalah and the Zohar? And that was the beginning of a change in a way that Rav Yiḥyah Qafih saw this intertwining that we spoke earlier between Rambam's position and the Kabbalah. But it's a very good question. I don't know exactly, but he maybe presented himself as someone that was born in French and then went to Eretz Israel, so he has a French accent. But I didn't see in the accounts anything how he was able to disguise himself. I agree, but on the other hand, a Yemenite Jew would know the differences. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't. I accept the question. In 1878, 8 years later, the grandfather passes away, and Rav Yiḥyah continues in this day cycle of learning and working, and almost no sleeping. And he continues very strongly until in 1885, when he's exactly 35 years old, Rav Chaim, his Rav, tells him, now you have came to the age, you came to the wisdom needed, you can open your own Beit Midrash. And indeed, after a few years, Rav Yiḥyah opens in his own home a room for his own Beit Midrash. He put a motto inscribed above the door, and on it it was written, Lemad heitev chakor vehiskalta. You should learn well, investigate, and hiskalta, and be informed. Or as I said, in Europe, his haskala became and be enlightened. Now, again, we have the way that they were learning in this Beit Midrash. It's amazing. After Arvit, he would learn Gemara in Iyun for 2 hours, and then Rambam's Mishnah Torah for an hour and a half. They would go to sleep. Then 3 hours before sunrise in the winter, and 2 hours before sunrise in the summer, there is just more night in the winter than in the summer. They would learn again Gemara till the time of Tefillah, then 2 hours Rambam. In Shabbat, Shabbat night, they would wake up in the middle of the night to learn Mishnah, of course, with Perush Rambam. And then again, after Tefillah, Musar, and then again Gemara, and then again Rambam. On Motzei Shabbat, he taught thought books, Machshava, especially from Jewish philosophers, such as Chovat HaLevavot and Rab Saadia Gaon, Emunot V'Deot, and also mathematics, Heshbon, Kufot Umazalot, astronomy, and in general, science, according to what they had in Yemen of the time. He followed the Rambam, believing that learning about the world is a religious duty and commitment that every Jew should know about the world as much as he can, because that is known the acts of Hashem. That is following in Rambam's trails, but something that was very different than what was going on in Yemen at the time. If you listen carefully to the menu of learning I just gave you, did you hear about the Zohar here? Or any other Kabbalah? Nothing. Now, Upton is not attacking anyone else, but he's setting now his own rhythm. He is walking, as they say, to his own flute. He is working very, very hard on saving manuscripts because many of the Yemenite Jews, as I said, there were almost no printed books. So they were using manuscripts. And some of them were very old. When someone would have a very old manuscript that you deem unnecessary anymore, they would just put it in Gniza. And many times these were books that were 400 years old, 500 years old, and someone that doesn't understand their value would put it in the Gniza of the shul, and then it would be buried in the cemetery. So Rav Yih Qafih would go to the cemeteries, dig up this book that were put to burial. And we have to this day, there are some exemplars that were only saved by his acts. One of them is a whole perush on the Mishnah from Rav Natan Gaon, Rav Natan Aviya Yeshiva. So that's from the time of the Geonim. So going back, dating back almost 1,000 years. There was only one example of a manuscript that he saved in one of these journeys into the cemeteries. Now you can, I don't know, you just think about going into a cemetery, beginning to dig. It's scary, and some people oppose this. They said you should let the Gniza rest. That's why it was put there. But he said, no, there are treasures that must be saved. Also at the time, because as I said, Yemenite was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and people could come from outside. Now came Jews, or not even non-Jews, but people that were antique traders, and they began to buy from the Yemenite Jews their manuscripts. Now, because there was such poverty in Yemen, many times they would sell this type of manuscript that were hundreds of years old for nickel and dime. And for these traders, they would come to Yemen, they would pay nothing for the manuscripts, take them to Europe. Many times they would cut them to pieces because then they would be able to charge more. They would sell them in different places. And Rav Qafih bemoaned it, but he was not able to stop that because he didn't have the money. So he only asked all these traders that came to Tzana, before they ship the manuscripts out, to let him have them for a few days so he can copy them. And there is a beautiful story about a certain manuscript that, again, very, very old manuscripts with specific formulations that he couldn't find in any other place. And the trader told him, I'm shipping it out tomorrow morning. If you want, you have the night. And hundreds of pages. So Rav Qafih had separated the manuscripts into 15 different bundles and gave 15 of his students to copy them out. And so he saved. Now, this manuscript went, we don't know who bought it and what happened to it. And again, the only place where it was saved is by the work of Rav Yih Qafih. So that is a great work that we all should be grateful to him to this day, because some of the books in our library only exist because of his work of saving the manuscripts. He also began, as he's becoming older and more famous, he has his own Talmidim now, he is beginning to try and uproot some of the superstitions that he found abound within the Jewish community. Now, again, he was not necessarily right now attacking Kabbalah minhagim. He was attacking minhagim that crept in from the Arab population. So just a few examples. When you build a new house, you are not allowed to come in until you slaughter an animal and give the master of the house the first portion. Who is the master of the house? That is a demon that controls the land, and you must appease him before you go in. So that's a minhag that obviously is not original to the Jews. It was picked from the Arab population, and Rav Yih Qafih told the Jews they're not allowed to do that because that is an avodah zarah. Another one, when someone is sick, you slaughter an animal and you give a portion to the demons, and the meat you give to the poor. So you see the problem in uprooting this minhag. But nonetheless, Rav Kapach fought very, very bitterly against all of these minhagim. And here he begins to get some opposition, as you can imagine. Because people don't like that you tamper with their minhagim. If my father did that, do you say that my father was doing avodah zarah? You see the problem. Now, he was very strong opinion. If there is one thing in which he is different in almost any aspect from Rav Teitelbaum spoke about in last week and the week before. But if there is one thing that is a similarity between them, he was very, very strong-minded. And when he saw a spade, he called it a spade. And that's not the way to win fans and to have influence, as they say. So many opponents, but he was, as I said, he stood for his opinions. In 1899, he is chosen as the Chacham Bashi of Yemen. So that's a very high position. However, he couldn't hold it for more than 2 or 3 years. And that is because he was not cut off the cloth that enabled him to do politics. And he got into fights with the Shochatim because he didn't want them. He wanted to do X and they wanted to follow their minhag. You can imagine what type of things happen when someone that is not respectful so much of minhagim, but is respectful of what he thinks is right and correct. Chakor, right? Investigate. Learn well. That is not follow what your father did. That is a very different mindset, which again has some similarity to Haskalah, right? To enlightenment. Dare to explore, right? Dare to investigate. Now, again, we speak about maskilim, so someone may think that he is an atheist, so very, very far, very far. But he is a Rambamist through and through. He's a Rambamist to the core. Everything that is not Rambam, and as a par excellence, that is not rational, is out of the window. Out of the window. And if he thinks that some halacha is the correct halacha according to the Rambam, that's how the Shochatim should do, but that's not their minhag, he doesn't care. Again, that doesn't create many friends. Also, he was, I think, now again, I hope that I'm speaking respectfully. I think that he was not very good at convincing people. He was an excellent teacher for young students or for students. Excellent. But it's very different being a teacher and being, maybe I would say, a rabbi to older people. You do not educate them in the same way. Let's put it that. And I think that this transformation was not easy for him. And in the end, they tried to burn his house. Jumping very, yeah. So just to understand what you are speaking about. And then his friends suggested to him that he should quit. And he was also very poor because he didn't want to take money for being a Rambashi, but he didn't have time now to do his goldsmithing. So he was also becoming very, very, very poor. And the internal pressure, together with the external pressure, did him, and he quitted after only a few years as the Chacham Bashi. The sage, the Chacham that replaced him was Muri Yiḥyah Yitzchak, also Yiḥyah. I apologize. The names tend to repeat themselves. So also Yiḥyah, but not Yiḥyah Qafih, is Yiḥyah Qafih. And the man that replaced him was called Yiḥyah Yitzchak. He was younger than him. It was learning in his Bet Midrash even for a time. But as you will see, that caused many tensions. When you're being replaced by someone that is younger and even in a way your student, but the man that replaced him did want to be the Rav Rashi, not the student anymore. That's an invitation for tensions. However, in 1905, all tensions and all disputations were deemed because in 1905 there is another revolt against the Ottomans, and that is a revolt by the Imam Yiḥyah ben Muhammad Hamid al-Adin. Ken. long name. Uh, I think no relation to the Aladdin from Walt Disney. And he conquers, meaning he besieges Sana'a, destroys almost all of the city, and the thousands of only the Jewish inhabitants, thousands died from hunger in this siege. Also, one young child of Rav Yiḥyah Qafih died from hunger. Also, an older son of him named Rav Shalom was jailed because he was blamed to be a counterfeiting of money, and in the jail he died. And that's, being jailed by the Ottoman Empire is not necessarily something that is good experience. He himself was only able to survive because he ate asabim, grass. Now, when you remember that he went with his grandfather to a village many, many years before. So there he taught him what grass he can eat. And he survived on grass. That's the amount, that's the type of deprivation they came into in 1905. Very, very difficult times. After that has passed, then you know how it is. There are machlokot and fights, and then there is some external trouble, so the fights are being tossed away. But after things return to normal, unfortunately, fights return to normal. I think I don't have to expand on that. So 1910, the Ottoman Empire was able to reconquer Sana'a, and they decide to modernize the Jewish community. So they want to open a modern school, Al-Maktub, a modern school. And who would be the best person to head the modern school? Rav Yiḥyah Qafih, who was excellent in sciences, was excellent in Torah, he was a teacher, he was a teaching personality. So he would be put as the head of this modern school. Also, he had connections with aliens, if you remember. So was able to extract some resources from them. He would be the best to be put as the head of the school. And indeed, he is being put as I think he was the president, and his son, Rav David, was the headmaster. And they are heading the school a few years. And now again, the accounts here differ extremely. Extremely. If you read from the accounts of Rav Qafih and his students, it was an excellent school in which the students would learn both Torah and sciences and were destined to become Gdolim Israel. If you read the accounts of the people that opposed, they said that was the root of epikorsut, of kfira, and the students knew no Torah. They were only learning sciences. Some of the sciences teachers were Arabs, and they are dragging their students to Islam. So how can I know? I cannot know. Obviously, the truth is somewhere in the middle, but I really cannot know. Here, something terrible happened. It is even more terrible that it is expected. The people that opposed the school looked for how to attack Rav Yiḥyah Qafih. And they found that the best way would be, because Rav Yiḥyah Qafih was known as an opposer of Kabbalah, and as I said, of the Zohar. He thought that the whole thing is basically almost a fake, and it came from the outside. It's not Jewish. The Rambam obviously would oppose all of it. And speaking about the 10 Sfirot, is like dividing the God into 10, and that is idol worshipping. But however, he was not necessarily preaching these opinions. It was known that that's what he holds, and that's what he teaches his own students, but it was not something that he was publishing. But he was not also a man that was concealed his opinions when asked. And so fight with him on the school was difficult because the government wanted the school, and also some of the parents wanted their children to learn sciences. But if you'd attack him on that point of Kabbalah that was accepted as holy of the holiness in Yemen, if he would be exposed as an heretic in Kabbalah, then that no one would accept him anymore. And so his opposers understood that that is his weakness. And if they will be able to trigger a response of him on that subject, then they would have him in. And as I said, it was not very difficult because he was not he was not a diplomat. If he would be asked, he would give his honest opinion. And if his honest opinion is, as they say in Yemen, that something is nereshkeit, then he would say that that is nonsense. And so they began to publish that he is a disbeliever in the Kabbalah and in the Zohar, and he didn't deny. And they asked the Chachamim of Yerushalayim to put him in ban and to excommunicate him. And indeed, in 1914, which I'm amazed. It's World War One. Jews are dying in the tens of thousands, and people are losing their homes. And what can I say? And we are here. What are we? Right? What are we dealing with? Banning someone. Very unfortunate. So they are sending letters to Yerushalayim and with testimonies about what Rav Qafih had said about the Zohar and about the Kabbalah. And indeed, they are being given exactly the response they hoped to be given. And Rav Yiḥyah Qafih is being banned by the Chachamim of Yerushalayim. And with this excommunication, they go to the government, to the Turkish government of Yemen, and they say, you have the man that is heading the school, he wants the students to become atheists. Now, you would say what the government cares. The government cares. Because if you are an Ottoman, then you want, as I said, everything should stay as it is. Do not change. Why? Because winds of change are winds of doom for the Ottoman Empire. And in Yemen, it was even worse because you are allowed to live in Yemen if you believe in Allah. So either that you are a Muslim, or you are a Christian, or you are a Jew. These are the only options viable. And if you are not a Jew, because the rabbis in Yerushalayim said that you are an heretic, so best case, you are to be expelled, and worst case, or even the normal case is, you will be killed. So they jail. After this malshinut, right, they is jail Rav Yiḥyah Qafih with some of his students and Rav David, his son, and they are being sentenced before the Imam. And it's the whole thing is ridiculous because both sides are now trying to prove to the Imam, is the Zohar fake or real? Now, that's a question that can be asked or not, but having the Imam judging that was, as I said, the whole thing was a sham. And in the end, the Imam, obviously, as I said, the Imam was not equipped to rule in such decisions. Now, the Imam said that you are not allowed to change anything from the tradition of the Jews. If the tradition of the Jews is to learn the Zohar and to do the Kabbalic minhagim, they should continue to follow that. And what he was willing to make, this Imam, that the Chacham Yiḥyah Qafih is not bound to be in the shul when they read the Zohar. So he's allowed to stay in his home. But he's not allowed to speak against the Zohar, and he's not allowed to teach anymore anyone, because his doctrines are obviously tainted. And the school, which was the life project of Rav Yiḥyah Qafih, and his hope to spread knowledge would be closed. And that's, for me, I think that's the saddest part of the story. I don't know, maybe there are sadder parts, but it's one of the saddest parts. Because what really happened was that Rav Yiḥyah Qafih was a man of truth. And if you would have asked, I don't know, a small person like myself, I would tell him, don't speak about Kabbalah, even just outward lie. Say, even if you don't believe in it, say that you do. Don't teach it. No one cares that you didn't teach. Pay your dues, and then continue with the project that you really are invested in. And that is the school. And that is the revival of the Rambam tradition. Why do you have to fight here against something that you have no way of winning? Because it is ingrained so strongly in the Jewish culture in Yemen, also abhorred. But that's because I guess, a weakling, and Rav Yeḥyah Qafih was a strong opinion man, and he wouldn't lie. He wouldn't lie. He would say his opinions. He continued to teach in secret, and a few years later, again, there was a halshana on him. He was being given to the government. And as you can imagine, the whole thing was a tension between Rav Yiḥyah. Rav Yitzchak was now the Chacham Bashi, the former student, and the former rabbi that is now in heretic. Again, you can only imagine the personal relationship involved. And he was being mulshan. How do you say mulshan? Is there such a word? A slander to the government, and they catch him while red-handed while he's teaching. They arrest him. They beat his son, Rav David, that was the former manager of the headmaster of the school. They beat him to death while jailing them. So these are heavy prices that he's paying for his opinions, for his clinging to the truth. What is the conclusion of Rav Qafih? It's very interesting. After all of this, then he's freed again. And his conclusion is that the reasons why he's being punished so severely by Hashem is because that up till now he didn't really fought back. That is the problem. He was more careful about his own honor than the honor of God. If he would really have been careful about the honor of God, he would be out in the open answering his critics. Now, again, I told you that my own conclusion would have been completely diametric, but that's obviously different of personality and of place. And so he begins to attack back. And he is beginning to publish books against Kabbalah and against the Zohar, articles and books. And he's even have a letter exchange with Rav Kook in Yerushalayim. The only one that didn't ban him was Rav Kook. Rav Kook wrote to him, he said, you are even allowed to your opinions. Now, Rav Kook was a Mekubal, not be wrong, but he said you are allowed to your opinions. And some other rabbis in earlier generations also believed that the Zohar was written later, etc., etc. I'm not going now into this discussion. He said, you are entitled to your opinions, but why do you have to attack so sharply? If you just speak calmly, then we would be able to have a conversation. But for this, again, just his personality, but also what he have gone through. You really think that someone just lost his son would just now speak quietly and nicely? He's not going to speak quietly and nicely. So he bent the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim back. Now, again, that was a type of a joke because the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim held all the power and he did nothing. But he's not going to be quiet anymore. And he's publishing books and bans. Very sad. The whole thing is very, very sad because, again, the school, they were teaching their Ivrit, and it was not a Zionist because they were very far removed from the political project of the Zionism. But he was teaching them Ivrit, and he was also teaching them about the importance of Eretz Israel. Something very big was able to be done there. And everything collapsed. He was able to gather a few students, again, a few dozens families that were later nicknamed the Dardaim, that is Yemenite for Dor De'ah, a generation of knowledge. Again, that is like enlightened, but very frum. And they would not eat from the shchita of the rest of the community because now they were, as I said, out on the open. They said, if you say that we are heretics because we disbelieve in Kabbalah, we say you are heretics because you believe in Kabbalah. Now, that is maybe, again, very good for response, but that is not something that is going to get you anywhere. And that's basically what happened. He was marginalized, and he wrote, and I think the whole thing is a tragedy. The whole thing is a tragedy. What was almost a miracle is that I said he had a grandson named Rav Yosef Qafih. Rav Yosef was the son of this Rav David that was murdered by the Turks when they jailed. And Rav Yih decided that he would be his heir, he would be his successor. And he taught him personally. And Rav Yosef Kapach became a giant, a genius. Again, there are books here in this library that were written or edited by Rav Yosef Kapach. He made Aliyah, he became a Dayan in Beit Adin Agadol in Yerushalayim, a very important Dayan. And he continued the tradition of his grandfather, a part of one thing. He completely abandoned the fight against the Zohar and Kabbalah. He didn't say from good to bad, just didn't speak about that. When he was asked, he said, I am not speaking about it. No comment, exactly. Exactly. And that gave him the ability to rise above this question and to really teach what he thought was important to teach. So I think that the legacy of Rav Yih Kapach in that sense was really saved by this grandson, and he was able to teach to his students, who are now, some of them are very important, Rav Ratzon Arusi, if some of you know, and others, very important rabbis in the Yemenite community and beyond, and they all carry this legacy of learn well, investigate, and be informed. And that's something I think that even if you are not a Yemenite, we can still appreciate and be inspired by. Thank you very much.
It's interesting, that Ottoman Empire